A respected airline pilot vanished into a deadly accusation after 3 bodies were discovered beside a burning Kentucky road. Christian Kit Martin spent years building the image of discipline and control. In Kentucky, many people knew him as a former Army pilot who later flew commercial aircraft. He had logged thousands of flight hours, served in the military, and lived the kind of life that projected precision. Neighbors described him as intelligent and confident. Court records and later testimony would reveal a far more complicated private world hiding underneath that polished exterior. Martin lived in Pembroke, Kentucky, a quiet area surrounded by farmland and long stretches of rural roads. The region rarely attracted national attention. People knew each other through church gatherings, military connections, or local businesses. That sense of familiarity made later events feel even more disturbing. When investigators eventually started piecing together the case, many residents struggled to believe that multiple lives could be destroyed within such an ordinary setting. Long before the killings, tension had already been growing around Martin's personal relationships. His marriage to Joan Martin had collapsed after years of conflict. Divorce proceedings became bitter and deeply personal. Allegations surfaced from both sides. Court hearings and custody disputes added pressure that continued building month after month. Those close to the family later described an atmosphere filled with resentment and distrust. One person who became closely connected to those disputes was Calvin Phillips. Phillips was a former Montgomery County Sheriff's deputy. Friends described him as dependable and protective. He had developed a relationship with Joan Martin after her separation from Christian Martin, and that relationship placed him directly into an increasingly hostile situation. Phillips was not someone who sought public attention. He lived quietly with his wife, Pamela Phillips, in rural Kentucky. Pamela was known for being warm, social, and deeply connected to her family. Together, they created a calm household that contrasted sharply with the legal and emotional chaos unfolding around them. Their neighbor, Edward Dancero, also became unintentionally tied to the story. Dancero was a longtime friend of the Phillips family. He often spent time around their property and maintained a close connection with them. Nothing about his routine suggested danger approaching. To outsiders, the three appeared to be ordinary people living ordinary lives. But investigators would later argue that the conflict surrounding Christian Martin had been escalating behind closed doors for years. Court documents revealed accusations connected to harassment, intimidation, and obsessive behavior. At various points, Martin faced legal trouble involving his ex-wife. There were claims of threatening actions and ongoing hostility connected to custody matters. The situation became so tense that multiple hearings and protective concerns emerged within the legal system. Each development added another layer to a growing feud that refused to disappear. Despite those problems, Martin continued maintaining his professional image. He flew commercial routes and carried himself with military confidence. To some people, that duality became difficult to understand later. They saw a man capable of operating sophisticated aircraft while simultaneously becoming entangled in deeply emotional personal conflicts. By November 2015, the atmosphere surrounding everyone involved had become strained. The Phillips property sat in a rural area near Pembroke, surrounded by open land and isolated roads. Nights there were usually quiet. Residents could drive for miles without seeing another vehicle. That isolation would soon become central to the investigation. On the evening of November 18th, Calvin and Pamela Phillips were believed to be at home. Edward Dancero was nearby as well. Nothing publicly documented suggested the three expected immediate danger. Hours later, that normal evening would turn into one of the most disturbing homicide cases Kentucky had seen in years. Early the next morning, emergency responders received reports of a vehicle fire along a roadside in Christian County. When firefighters arrived, they found a burned vehicle with human remains inside. The scene immediately raised alarm. Investigators realized this was not a simple accident. The condition of the vehicle suggested deliberate destruction, and authorities quickly began working to identify the victims. At nearly the same time, concern was growing at the Phillips residence. Investigators eventually discovered another body inside the home belonging to Edward Dancero. The discovery transformed the situation from a suspicious death investigation into a triple homicide case. Detectives now faced multiple crime scenes connected across the same rural area. News spread rapidly through the community. Residents struggled to understand how three people connected through friendship and proximity could all end up dead within the same night. Rumors started immediately. Some wondered whether the killings were random. Others privately questioned whether the long-running personal disputes involving Christian Martin could somehow be connected. Authorities moved carefully during the early stages of the investigation. Detectives examined the burned vehicle, processed the Phillips property, and interviewed anyone connected to the victims. Friends and relatives described shock and fear rippling across the county. People who knew Calvin and Pamela Phillips described them as caring and grounded. Edward Dancero's death added another layer of tragedy because investigators believed he may have simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. As evidence teams worked through the scenes, attention quietly began turning toward Martin. The history between Martin and Calvin Phillips was already known to some investigators because of the ongoing legal disputes involving Martin's ex-wife. Phillips had reportedly played a role in matters connected to Joe and Martin during the divorce conflict. That history immediately made detectives examine whether the murders could have been targeted rather than random. What disturbed investigators even more was the level of planning they suspected early on. The burned vehicle suggested an attempt to destroy evidence. The separate crime scenes indicated movement during the night. Detectives began reconstructing timelines, reviewing phone records, and tracing vehicle activity throughout the area. Every hour uncovered new questions. Meanwhile, Christian Martin continued living under growing scrutiny. Publicly, little information had been released during those first days. But behind the scenes, investigators were slowly building a picture they believed pointed toward something personal and calculated. Friends of the victims later recalled feeling uneasy as rumors intensified around the former pilot. Then, another detail emerged. Investigators learned that Martin had once been accused of making threats connected to the same people now dead. The allegations were not new. Some had surfaced during earlier legal battles tied to custody and divorce proceedings. Suddenly, past accusations that once seemed buried were being pulled back into focus. For detectives, the timeline became critical. They needed to determine who had seen the victims last. They examined surveillance footage, phone activity, and movements across Christian County during the hours surrounding the killings. The deeper they looked, the more complex the case appeared. And before long, investigators believed they had found evidence placing Christian Martin far closer to the murders than anyone publicly realized. By the end of November 2015, investigators were no longer treating Christian Kit Martin as a distant possibility. Detectives believed the evidence was beginning to form a direct path toward him, though proving a triple homicide case would require far more than suspicion. The Kentucky State Police started reconstructing the final movements of Calvin and Pamela Phillips, along with Edward Dancero. Interviews with friends, family members, and local residents established that the victims had not been involved in dangerous activity or criminal disputes outside the conflict surrounding Martin. Detectives repeatedly returned to the same question: who had the strongest personal motive to target all three victims at once? Attention quickly focused on Martin's relationship with his ex-wife and the bitter custody battle that had consumed years of his life. Court records revealed repeated hostility between Martin and people connected to Joe and Martin. Calvin Phillips had become closely tied to that conflict because of his relationship with her. Prosecutors would later argue that Martin viewed Phillips not only as a romantic rival, but as someone interfering with his family life and reputation. Investigators also examined Martin's behavior in the days surrounding the killings. Phone records, vehicle movements, and witness statements became essential pieces of the timeline. Authorities believed the murders involved planning rather than sudden violence. The burned vehicle suggested an effort to conceal evidence, while the separate crime scenes indicated deliberate movement after the killings occurred. As forensic teams processed evidence, another disturbing detail emerged. Investigators determined that Calvin and Pamela Phillips had likely been moved after their deaths before the vehicle fire was started. That discovery changed the nature of the investigation entirely. Detectives now believed someone had attempted to erase critical evidence and delay identification. Meanwhile, the Phillips family was struggling through overwhelming grief while facing intense media attention. National outlets soon picked up the story because of Martin's background as a commercial airline pilot and former military officer. The contrast between his professional image and the accusations surrounding him drew widespread public fascination. But investigators still needed physical evidence strong enough to support charges. Search warrants allowed authorities to examine Martin's property, vehicles, electronics, and communication records. Detectives searched for anything connecting him directly to the crime scenes. Prosecutors later stated that several findings became central to the case, though many details remained tightly controlled during the active investigation phase. Then came a major development. Investigators claimed they uncovered evidence suggesting Martin had attempted to create misleading explanations regarding his whereabouts. Detectives reportedly found inconsistencies in statements connected to the timeline of the murders. Those inconsistencies increased suspicion that critical information was being concealed. At the same time, prosecutors examined Martin's history more closely. Past allegations involving threatening behavior resurfaced publicly. Witnesses connected to earlier legal disputes described years of escalating hostility surrounding the divorce and custody conflicts. The prosecution would later argue that resentment had steadily intensified until it reached a deadly point. Martin denied involvement. His defense maintained that investigators were building a case around assumptions tied to his personal conflicts rather than direct proof. Supporters pointed to his military background and professional aviation career, arguing that public perception was turning against him before trial proceedings even began. Still, detectives continued building their timeline. Investigators analyzed surveillance footage from roads and businesses throughout the area. They reviewed travel patterns and communication records hour by hour. The case became increasingly technical, relying heavily on forensic reconstruction rather than eyewitness testimony alone. For many residents in Christian County, fear lingered long after the bodies were discovered. The murders shattered the sense of safety common in rural communities. People locked doors more carefully. Families avoided isolated roads late at night. Residents who knew the victims personally struggled to process how quickly ordinary lives had ended in violence. Then, in 2019, nearly 4 years after the killings, authorities made their move. Christian Martin was arrested and formally charged with the murders of Calvin Phillips, Pamela Phillips, and Edward Dancero. News cameras captured images of the former pilot in custody, a moment that transformed years of suspicion into a national headline. Prosecutors announced they intended to prove the killings were deliberate and carefully planned. The case immediately drew intense media attention because of Martin's military service, aviation background, and the deeply personal motive investigators described. Court hearings revealed additional details about the long-running hostility connected to the victims. But one revelation during the legal proceedings shocked observers even further. Prosecutors claimed they possessed forensic and circumstantial evidence tying Martin directly to the crimes in ways the public had not previously understood. Investigators believed the case against him was becoming far stronger than early reports suggested. And as the trial approached, both sides prepared for a legal battle that would expose years of private conflict, accusations, and evidence hidden beneath the surface of a quiet Kentucky community. When Christian Kit Martin's case finally reached trial, prosecutors faced the difficult task of connecting years of personal conflict to 3 murders carried out without surviving witnesses. The investigation had taken nearly 4 years, and by the time courtroom proceedings began, the killings had already become one of Kentucky's most closely followed criminal cases. Prosecutors argued that Martin's motive centered on revenge, obsession, and anger connected to his collapsing personal life. According to the state, Calvin Phillips had become a target because of his relationship with Martin's ex-wife, Joanne. Pamela Phillips and Edward Dancero, prosecutors claimed, were killed because they were present during the attack and tied to the same circle of people Martin blamed for his problems. The trial unfolded through forensic evidence, timelines, and testimony from investigators who had spent years reconstructing the events of November 18th and 19th, 2015. Jurors heard details about the burned vehicle discovered along the roadside in Christian County. Investigators explained how evidence suggested an attempt had been made to destroy physical traces connected to the killings. Prosecutors also presented evidence connected to vehicle movements, phone activity, and witness statements that they argued placed Martin near critical locations during the timeline of the murders. The defense challenged those conclusions aggressively. Martin's attorneys argued that the prosecution relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence. They questioned whether investigators had developed tunnel vision because of Martin's history with the victims and his contentious divorce. The defense maintained there was no eyewitness who directly saw Martin commit the killings. But prosecutors continued building their narrative piece by piece. Jurors learned more about the years of hostility surrounding the custody battle and allegations involving threatening behavior. Witness testimony described ongoing tension and fear connected to Martin's disputes with people close to his ex-wife. Prosecutors argued that the conflict had escalated far beyond ordinary divorce anger. The courtroom atmosphere often became emotionally heavy, especially when testimony focused on the victims themselves. Family members described Calvin and Pamela Phillips as caring people whose lives revolved around family and routine. Edward Dancero's loved one spoke about losing someone who had simply been caught in a deadly situation connected to people around him. Their testimonies reminded jurors that the case was not only about forensic evidence or legal arguments. 3 lives had been permanently erased. As the trial continued, prosecutors introduced additional forensic findings and investigative details that strengthened their timeline. Investigators testified about inconsistencies they believed existed in Martin's explanations regarding his whereabouts and actions during the critical hours surrounding the murders. The defense continued insisting the state's case left unanswered questions. Still, after hearing weeks of testimony, jurors reached a decision. In June 2021, Christian Kit Martin was convicted on all counts connected to the murders of Calvin Phillips, Pamela Phillips, and Edward Dancero. The verdict marked the end of a legal battle that had stretched across years of investigation, hearings, and public scrutiny. Martin received multiple life sentences. For the victims' families, the conviction brought a measure of closure, though many later acknowledged that no sentence could fully repair the damage left behind. The killings had permanently altered multiple families and shaken an entire community. The case continued attracting national attention after the conviction because of Martin's unusual background. Media outlets revisited his military service, aviation career, and the personal conflicts that prosecutors argued ultimately led to violence. Court images, arrest photographs, and years of archived news coverage spread widely online, keeping public fascination with the case alive long after the trial ended. But beneath the headlines remained a far quieter reality. 3 people who once lived ordinary lives in rural Kentucky never returned home. Families who once gathered for holidays and routine weekends were left speaking about their loved ones through courtroom testimony and memorial photographs instead. Even years later, residents in Christian County still remembered how shocking the case felt when news first spread about the burned vehicle and the bodies discovered that morning. In communities where people expect peace and familiarity, crimes like this leave lasting scars. And perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire story was how normal everything appeared from the outside before it happened. A respected pilot, a quiet rural town, long roads stretching through Kentucky farmland. Then one night, hidden behind years of resentment and conflict, 3 lives disappeared, and an ordinary community became the scene of a case nobody there would ever forget. A quiet campsite in Victoria's mountains became the center of one of Australia's most unsettling criminal investigations. Russell Hill loved the Victorian high country more than almost anywhere else on Earth. Friends described him as experienced, organized, and deeply attached to the outdoors. He spent years exploring remote bush tracks, camping in isolated valleys, and documenting trips with cameras and radios. Even in retirement, he kept routines shaped by discipline and preparation. He planned routes carefully, maintained equipment meticulously, and preferred locations far away from crowded campgrounds. By 2020, Hill was 74 years old, but age had done little to slow him down. He still drove into rough terrain most people avoided. The high country was familiar territory to him. It stretched across southeastern Australia with dense bushland, winding dirt tracks, steep ridges, and campsites separated by hours of driving. Mobile reception disappeared quickly in those regions. Once vehicles entered the mountains, they could vanish from public view entirely. Carol Clay shared Hill's love for camping. She was 73, adventurous, and known for her warmth and humor. Friends said she enjoyed photography, nature, and quiet weekends away from city life. She and Hill had known each other for years, and by March 2020, they planned another trip into the wilderness together. Australia was entering an uncertain period during the early months of the pandemic. Travel restrictions and lockdown concerns were beginning to dominate national attention. Yet the high country remained vast and largely empty. For experienced campers like Hill, isolation was part of the appeal. On March 19, 2020, Hill and Clay traveled into the Wanangata Valley area. The region was extremely remote, surrounded by forest and rough mountain terrain. Campers often described the landscape as beautiful but unforgiving. If something went wrong, help could be hours away. Hill carried communication equipment during the trip, including a high-frequency radio system. He regularly contacted fellow campers and friends while traveling. Those communications later became important to investigators because they established a timeline of the couple's final known movements. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Hill spoke with friends over radio during the trip and discussed ordinary camping activities. The pair settled into their campsite near Dry River Creek. Nearby tracks were occasionally used by hunters, four-wheel drive travelers, and seasonal visitors, but long stretches of silence were common. At night, the bush became almost completely dark except for campfires and vehicle lights. Then another camper entered the area. Greg Lynn was a former airline pilot for Melbourne. At the time, he was 55 years old and camping alone in the same region. Lynn had worked for Jetstar and previously served as a commercial pilot for decades. People who knew him often described him as intelligent, private, and experienced outdoors. He also enjoyed remote camping and hunting trips in isolated parts of Victoria. Unlike Hill and Clay, Lynn was not initially known publicly when the case began. His name would emerge much later. In the high country, campers sometimes crossed paths unexpectedly. Tracks narrowed into single routes. Campsites were shared temporarily. Minor disagreements occasionally happened over noise, space, or hunting activity. Most ended quickly. But during the evening of March 20th, tension appeared to develop somewhere near the campsites around Wanangata Valley. One of the final confirmed communications from Russell Hill occurred that evening. He contacted another camper over radio and mentioned concerns about a drone flying over the campsite area. According to accounts later examined in court, Hill seemed irritated by the activity. It was one of the last known indications that he and Clay were alive. After that, communication stopped. Days passed without alarm at first. Remote campers sometimes stayed off-grid longer than expected. But concerns slowly began building among friends and relatives after Hill failed to check in. His vehicle remained unreturned. Calls went unanswered. The silence felt wrong. Russell Hill was considered highly reliable. People familiar with him said disappearing without contact was deeply out of character. As concern intensified, police were notified. Search efforts began in the Victorian High Country. Investigators faced immediate challenges. The terrain covered enormous distances filled with dense bushland, river crossings, and narrow tracks. Helicopters scanned valleys, while officers searched campsites and surrounding areas. Media outlets across Australia soon picked up the story. Then authorities located Hill's campsite. What investigators found immediately raised disturbing questions. The campsite showed signs of fire damage. Hill's vehicle had been burned. Personal belongings were scattered. Yet neither Hill nor Clay were anywhere nearby. There was no clear indication they had simply packed up and left voluntarily. Experienced search personnel understood how unusual that scene was. Vehicles do not normally burn accidentally in remote campsites without explanation. Campers do not usually abandon equipment and disappear completely. The destruction at the site suggested something serious had happened. Police intensified search operations across the high country. Volunteers joined efforts across rough terrain. Helicopters moved repeatedly through mountain valleys, while officers examined tracks and campsites connected to the area. Public attention expanded rapidly. News bulletins showed aerial footage of the wilderness and photographs of the missing pair. Families appealed for information. Investigators interviewed travelers who had been in the region during March 2020. Among those identified was Greg Lynn. At first, Lynn appeared to be simply another camper who had been nearby. He spoke with investigators and acknowledged being in the area around the same time Hill and Clay disappeared. But the case remained difficult. The environment itself complicated every stage of the investigation. Months passed. The disappearance became one of Australia's most closely watched missing persons cases. The mystery deepened because there seemed to be almost no trace of the couple beyond the damaged campsite. Search teams repeatedly returned to the mountains, hoping weather conditions or new information might reveal evidence hidden within the bush. Investigators examined phone records, vehicle movements, witness accounts, and camping timelines. Every confirmed sighting mattered. Every track through the high country became significant. Meanwhile, media helicopters captured images of police combing through remote forests. Reporters questioned how two experienced campers could vanish so completely. Public speculation grew nationwide. Then detectives uncovered information suggesting the disappearance may not have been an accident at all. Attention increasingly shifted toward the interactions between campers in the valley during those final days. Questions emerged about arguments, movements between campsites, and the timeline surrounding March 20th. Authorities remained cautious publicly, but behind the scenes, investigators were building a far more serious case. And more than a year after Russell Hill and Carol Clay vanished into the mountains, police prepared for a dramatic development that would change the investigation completely. By November 2021, investigators believed the mystery surrounding the Victorian High Country had entered a critical stage. After nearly 20 months of searching, interviewing witnesses, and reconstructing movements through remote bush tracks, homicide detectives made a major move. Greg Lynn was arrested at a campsite near Arbuckle Junction in Victoria's east. Officers from the Special Operations Group approached him in the wilderness before transporting him back to Melbourne for questioning. News footage showed police vehicles moving through forest tracks, while helicopters circled overhead. Across Australia, headlines immediately focused on the former airline pilot connected to the disappearance of Russell Hill and Carol Clay. Inside police interviews, Lynn admitted he had been present during a confrontation at the Wanangata Valley campsite in March 2020. But his explanation shocked investigators. According to Lynn, the deaths were accidental. He claimed an argument erupted after Russell Hill became angry about a drone allegedly being flown near the campsite. Lynn told detectives the confrontation escalated around firearms inside the camp area. During the struggle, he said, a shot was fired accidentally, killing Carol Clay. He then claimed Hill rushed toward him with a knife, causing another violent struggle that ended with Hill's death. Investigators immediately focused on inconsistencies. Lynn did not report the incident to authorities. Instead, prosecutors alleged he spent hours attempting to erase evidence from the scene. Police believed the campsite fire, the destruction of Hill's vehicle, and the movement of bodies through remote bushland were deliberate attempts to conceal what had happened. The disappearance case instantly transformed into a homicide investigation. Public interest exploded. Australian media published images of Lynn entering court, alongside photographs of Hill and Clay during happier times outdoors. Reporters revisited the isolated valley where the couple had last been seen alive. Search helicopters once again returned to the high country as investigators searched for physical evidence connected to Lynn's account. Then came another grim discovery. During searches of remote bushland in 2021, police located human remains in the Union Spur track area, not far from the original campsite region. Forensic testing later confirmed the remains belonged to Russell Hill and Carol Clay. The finding answered one question but intensified many others. Investigators alleged the bodies had been moved from the original campsite and concealed in remote terrain. Prosecutors later told the court that Lynn burned parts of the scene and attempted to destroy evidence after the deaths occurred. Lynn was charged with 2 counts of murder. As the case moved toward trial, the prosecution and defense prepared dramatically different versions of what happened in the mountains. Crown prosecutors argued Lynn intentionally killed Carol Clay and then murdered Russell Hill to eliminate a witness. They alleged his actions afterward showed calculated efforts to avoid detection. According to prosecutors, Lynn's background as an experienced pilot and outdoorsman gave him the ability to navigate remote terrain carefully and remain composed under pressure. The defense rejected that version completely. Lynn's legal team argued the deaths occurred during a chaotic accident and confrontation rather than a planned attack. They claimed panic drove his decisions afterward, including the concealment of evidence and failure to contact authorities. The distinction became central to the trial. Inside the courtroom, jurors were shown detailed maps of the high country, campsite photographs, police search footage, and evidence gathered across the long investigation. Witnesses described the terrain, the campsite conditions, and the timeline reconstructed by detectives. One of the most closely examined details involved Hill's final radio transmission mentioning a drone near the campsite. Prosecutors suggested it reflected rising tension before the fatal confrontation. The defense argued it supported Lynn's account that conflict unexpectedly escalated between the campers. The trial drew intense media attention throughout 2024. Every court appearance generated headlines across Australia. News crews waited outside the Supreme Court of Victoria while journalists analyzed testimony daily. For many observers, the case carried unusual fascination because of its setting. The idea that 2 campers could vanish in such a remote wilderness, followed by allegations of concealment deep inside the mountains, created a story that felt almost impossible to comprehend. But prosecutors focused jurors on one central issue. Not only had Hill and Clay died in isolation, authorities argued, but Lynn had taken extensive steps afterward instead of seeking emergency help. His movements after leaving the high country became a major part of the prosecution case. As proceedings continued, jurors faced the difficult task of separating panic from intent. Then, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the courtroom finally reached the moment that would determine Greg Lynn's future. The verdict would leave Australia divided over exactly what happened in the darkness of the Wanangata Valley. In June 2024, after weeks of evidence and intense public attention, the jury inside the Supreme Court of Victoria delivered its verdict. Greg Lynn was found guilty of murdering Carol Clay. He was acquitted of the murder of Russell Hill. The decision immediately triggered debate across Australia. Outside the courthouse, reporters rushed to deliver updates, while cameras captured reactions from legal teams and members of the victims' families. For many observers who had followed the case since 2020, the mixed verdict reflected the complexity surrounding what happened at the remote campsite in the Victorian High Country. Jurors had spent days reviewing conflicting accounts, forensic evidence, and Lynn's own admissions. Prosecutors argued Lynn deliberately killed both campers before attempting to destroy evidence across the bushland. The defense insisted the confrontation spiraled out of control during a sudden struggle, and that panic shaped Lynn's actions afterward. Ultimately, the jury accepted beyond reasonable doubt that Carol Clay had been murdered. But in Russell Hill's case, jurors were not satisfied that prosecutors had disproven the defense argument surrounding the violent confrontation Lynn described. Under Australian law, that uncertainty mattered enormously. Even with the acquittal on one charge, The conviction marked the end of one of Australia's most disturbing wilderness crime investigations. During sentencing hearings, prosecutors outlined the scale of the concealment operation following the deaths. The court heard Lynn burned parts of the campsite, disposed of evidence, and moved the bodies into remote bushland rather than contacting emergency services. Those actions became a major focus because they prolonged the suffering of families who spent months desperately searching for answers. Family members of Carol Clay and Russell Hill addressed the court about the emotional damage caused by the disappearances and the years of uncertainty that followed. The loss had already been devastating, but the inability to know what happened for such a long period created another layer of trauma entirely. Search crews, volunteers, police officers, and local communities had spent countless hours combing through rugged terrain, hoping to find clues. Helicopters crossed valleys repeatedly. Officers navigated steep tracks and dense forest under harsh conditions. Even experienced investigators acknowledged how difficult the high country environment made the search. The case also exposed the unique risks connected to extreme isolation. The Onondaga Valley region is breathtaking, but it can quickly become unforgiving. Communication disappears. Roads narrow into rough tracks. Distances between campsites stretch for kilometers. Once darkness falls, the wilderness becomes almost completely silent. That isolation became central to the tragedy. Inside court, prosecutors argued that Lynn relied on the remoteness of the high country to conceal evidence and avoid immediate detection. The delay in discovering the bodies complicated forensic work and left investigators reconstructing events largely through circumstantial evidence, timelines, and Lynn's own statements. Throughout the investigation, detectives assembled one of the largest missing persons operations in Victorian history. They examined vehicle data, campsite activity, witness sightings, communications records, and movements through the region over many months. The amount of terrain involved made every breakthrough difficult. Despite the conviction, some questions remain unresolved publicly. The precise sequence of events during the confrontation has never been fully established beyond dispute. The jury's split verdict reflected that uncertainty. Even after years of investigation and a lengthy trial, the final moments inside the campsite remain known only to Greg Lynn. For the families, however, the verdict provided at least part of the accountability they had sought since 2020. Carol Clay was remembered by loved ones as adventurous, compassionate, and deeply connected to nature. Russell Hill remained known as a skilled outdoorsman whose passion for the high country shaped much of his life. Photographs shown throughout media coverage often captured the pair smiling during camping trips long before the case became national news. Meanwhile, Greg Lynn's fall stunned many people who knew of his previous professional life. A former commercial pilot trusted with passenger aircraft had become the central figure in one of Australia's most heavily covered criminal trials. The contrast between those worlds fascinated the public. News outlets revisited every stage of the investigation repeatedly. The burned campsite, the missing campers, the police helicopters over mountain valleys, and the dramatic arrest in the wilderness. Documentary crews and journalists later described the case as one of the most haunting Australian crime stories of recent years because of the isolation, secrecy, and unanswered details surrounding the confrontation. But beyond the headlines, two families lost loved ones in a remote valley that should have been remembered only for its quiet beauty. And somewhere deep within the Victorian high country, long after the search teams left and the cameras disappeared, the silence returned to the bushland where Russell Hill and Carol Clay were last seen alive. 31,000 feet above Oregon, an off-duty pilot suddenly reached for controls that could silence both engines. Joseph Emerson had spent most of his adult life inside cockpits. Colleagues described him as calm, experienced, and deeply committed to aviation. He flew for Alaska Airlines after years working within the same regional airline network, building a reputation that never suggested the kind of headlines that would later circle the world. He lived in Pleasant Hill, California, with his wife and children, balancing long work schedules with family life and the demanding routines of commercial aviation. To passengers, airline pilots often appear almost untouchable. Trained, controlled, precise. But behind that image, the profession carries constant pressure. Long hours, sleep disruption, medical evaluations, endless responsibility for hundreds of lives at a time. Pilots are expected to remain composed under conditions that wear heavily on the body and mind. By October 2023, Emerson's private struggles had reportedly become difficult to manage. According to court records, he had been dealing with severe emotional stress after the death of a close friend. Investigators later learned he had also been suffering from extended sleep deprivation. In interviews after his arrest, Emerson claimed he had not truly slept in nearly 40 hours before boarding the flight that changed everything. What nobody around him understood at the time was how quickly his mental condition appeared to be deteriorating. On October 22, 2023, Horizon Air Flight 2059 prepared to depart from Everett, Washington, heading toward San Francisco. The aircraft was an Embraer 175 operating on behalf of Alaska Airlines. On board were 79 passengers and several crew members. Joseph Emerson was not working that flight. He was traveling off-duty in what aviation calls the jump seat, an extra cockpit seat often used by authorized airline personnel commuting between locations. To the crew, Emerson was not a stranger. He was another pilot heading home. Nothing during boarding reportedly raised alarm. The plane took off normally. Passengers settled into the routine most flights follow after departure. Seat belts loosened. Cabin conversation started. Some travelers opened laptops, while others stared out windows at the cloudy Pacific Northwest sky. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere also appeared routine. The captain and first officer focused on standard flight operations, while Emerson occupied the jump seat behind them. Commercial cockpits are highly controlled environments built around communication and procedure. Every movement is monitored. Every checklist matters. But somewhere during the flight, the situation began to shift. Later court documents revealed Emerson started experiencing what he described as a dreamlike state. He reportedly believed reality itself no longer felt real. Investigators would later connect those claims to psychedelic mushrooms Emerson admitted taking roughly 2 days earlier. The timeline became deeply unsettling. According to investigators, Emerson told authorities he felt detached from reality during the flight and believed he might be trapped inside a dream. He later claimed he thought pulling certain cockpit handles could somehow wake him up. Those handles were not harmless controls. They were connected to the aircraft's engine fire suppression system. On modern aircraft like the Embraer 175, pulling those emergency handles can trigger procedures designed for catastrophic engine fires. If activated fully during flight, fuel to the engines can be shut off. At cruising altitude, that becomes an unimaginable emergency. None of the passengers knew any of this. Most were simply traveling home. Some had families waiting in California. Others were business travelers expecting an ordinary landing a few hours later. Children sat beside parents. Flight attendants moved through the aisle offering routine service while the aircraft crossed the skies near Oregon. Then something inside the cockpit changed instantly. According to official reports, Emerson suddenly said, "I'm not okay." Seconds later, he reached toward the emergency shutoff handles. The pilots reacted immediately. Investigators later confirmed the crew prevented full engine shutdown before disaster occurred. The struggle inside the cockpit lasted only moments, but those moments carried enormous consequences. One pilot quickly declared an emergency to air traffic control. The transmission stunned controllers listening below. "We've got the guy that tried to shut our engines down." Inside the cabin, passengers still did not fully understand what was unfolding. The crew removed Emerson from the cockpit and moved him toward the back of the aircraft. Witnesses later described him as strangely calm at times, then emotionally distressed moments later. According to charging documents, Emerson allegedly told a flight attendant he needed to be restrained. The aircraft diverted toward Portland, Oregon. Every minute now mattered. Pilots focused on stabilizing the situation, while flight attendants monitored Emerson in the cabin. Investigators later stated that during the diversion, Emerson also moved toward an emergency exit area before being stopped by crew members. Meanwhile, air traffic controllers coordinated priority landing clearance. On the ground, law enforcement officers prepared for arrival. Passengers aboard Flight 2059 finally realized something serious was happening when the aircraft changed course. Confusion spread through the cabin. Some travelers looked out windows, trying to identify the airport below. Others noticed tension in the faces of flight attendants. Still, very few understood how close the flight may have come to catastrophe. The plane landed safely at Portland International Airport. Police officers boarded almost immediately. Joseph Emerson was taken into custody without major incident. But as investigators began questioning him, the story became even more disturbing. According to affidavits later released publicly, Emerson allegedly admitted pulling the handles. He reportedly told investigators he believed he was dreaming and wanted to wake up. Authorities also said he disclosed recent psychedelic mushroom use and described severe exhaustion. News of the incident exploded internationally within hours. The idea that an off-duty airline pilot had allegedly attempted to interfere with aircraft engines during a commercial flight sent shockwaves through the aviation industry. Television networks interrupted programming. Aviation experts flooded news broadcasts. Social media filled with discussions about airline mental health screening, cockpit access, and pilot stress. Then investigators uncovered another detail that intensified everything even further. There were 83 other people on board that aircraft when Emerson reached for those controls. The moment Flight 2059 touched down in Portland, investigators moved quickly to understand exactly what had happened inside the cockpit. Federal authorities treated the incident with extreme urgency. Commercial aviation depends on layers of trust, procedure, and psychological stability. An event involving an airline pilot attempting to interfere with engine controls immediately raised questions far beyond a single flight. Joseph Emerson was escorted from the aircraft and questioned by police and federal agents. Body camera footage later released publicly showed him appearing emotionally drained and detached. At times he spoke calmly. Other moments felt disoriented and fragmented. According to court documents, Emerson allegedly told officers, "I pulled both emergency shutoff handles because I thought I was dreaming." Investigators also said he admitted taking psychedelic mushrooms about 48 hours before boarding the aircraft. Emerson reportedly described feeling trapped in a mental fog that had intensified throughout the flight. The statements shocked aviation experts. Pilots operate under strict medical and psychological standards. Even over-the-counter medications are carefully regulated within the industry. Federal investigators now faced a disturbing possibility. A licensed commercial pilot may have experienced a severe mental health crisis inside an active cockpit while responsible for passenger safety. Meanwhile, passengers from Flight 2059 were still processing what they had narrowly escaped. Many only learned the full seriousness of the event after landing. News alerts spread through phones across the airport terminal, while travelers contacted family members. Several later described feelings of disbelief after discovering how close the aircraft may have come to a catastrophic emergency. Inside the cockpit, investigators reconstructed the timeline second by second. The captain and first officer later explained that Emerson suddenly became physically aggressive toward the engine fire handles located overhead. The pilots reacted almost instantly, preventing the handles from completing the shutdown sequence. That response became critical. Aviation analysts later explained that losing engine power at cruising altitude would have created an immediate emergency scenario. Modern commercial aircraft are designed with safety redundancies, but an intentional dual-engine shutdown during flight carries enormous danger. Federal prosecutors moved fast. Joseph Emerson was charged with 83 counts of attempted murder, corresponding to every person aboard the aircraft. Additional charges included reckless endangerment and endangering an aircraft. The scale of the charges reflected how seriously authorities viewed the incident. But almost immediately, another conversation began developing alongside the criminal case. Mental health. Friends and family members reportedly expressed concern over Emerson's emotional condition in the period leading up to the flight. Investigators learned he had experienced severe grief following the death of a close friend. Reports also suggested he had struggled with depression and overwhelming stress. Then came the issue of sleep deprivation. According to statements later presented publicly, Emerson claimed he had barely slept for nearly 2 full days before boarding the plane. Medical experts frequently warn that extreme sleep loss can distort perception, impair judgment, and trigger severe psychological symptoms. Combined with psychedelic substances, the consequences can become unpredictable. Still, prosecutors emphasized a critical point. Regardless of mental condition, Emerson had physically attempted to interfere with vital aircraft systems carrying dozens of passengers. The FAA and airline industry immediately faced scrutiny. Questions emerged about pilot wellness programs, reporting systems, and whether emotional distress among pilots was being adequately addressed before reaching crisis levels. Aviation unions also weighed in, arguing that mental health treatment within the industry often carries stigma because pilots fear losing medical certification. That fear can discourage people from seeking help early. While those larger debates intensified publicly, investigators continued examining Emerson's digital history, travel activity, and communications leading up to the flight. Authorities reportedly found no evidence suggesting terrorism or political motives. Instead, the case increasingly appeared centered on psychological collapse. Yet the emotional impact on passengers remained profound. Several travelers later described replaying the incident repeatedly in their minds. Parents thought about children seated beside them. Crew members faced questions about how they managed to contain the situation before panic spread through the cabin. The 2 pilots in the cockpit were widely praised for their speed and composure. Without their immediate reaction, investigators believed the outcome could have been far worse. As the criminal case advanced, Emerson's defense team began signaling a strategy focused heavily on mental state and diminished capacity. Court hearings started drawing national media attention, with reporters packed inside federal courtrooms following every development. Then another revelation surfaced. Before boarding Flight 2059, Emerson had reportedly told investigators he experienced an intense sense of unreality for days. He later described feeling disconnected from the world around him, as though reality itself had become distorted. The statements deepened public concern about how invisible psychological crises can become until they erupt without warning. But prosecutors preparing the case focused on actions, not emotions. They argued that regardless of confusion or impairment, Emerson knowingly reached for emergency engine controls on a passenger aircraft carrying 83 people through the skies over Oregon. And as federal investigators continued building their timeline, attention turned toward one critical question. How close had Flight 2059 actually come to disaster? As investigators finalized their reconstruction of Flight 2059, aviation experts began analyzing the cockpit data in extraordinary detail. The findings confirmed just how narrow the margin had been. According to federal investigators, Joseph Emerson successfully moved the engine fire handles partway before the pilots stopped him. Aviation specialists later explained that those controls are protected and designed to prevent accidental activation, but in the wrong circumstances, they can interrupt fuel flow to the engines. The cockpit crew's reaction prevented the situation from escalating further. That single fact remained at the center of nearly every discussion surrounding the case. Inside courtrooms, prosecutors argued the event represented one of the most alarming in-flight security incidents involving a certified airline pilot in recent American history. The image itself was difficult for the public to process. An experienced commercial aviator accused of trying to interfere with the engines of a passenger jet while seated inside the cockpit. But the defense presented a very different picture. Joseph Emerson's attorneys described a man experiencing a severe psychological crisis driven by exhaustion, emotional trauma, and psychedelic drug use. They argued he had not acted from hatred, ideology, or calculated intent to kill passengers. Instead, they claimed he was detached from reality and incapable of understanding the full consequences of his actions in that moment. Medical and psychological evaluations became central to the proceedings. Court records showed Emerson underwent extensive mental health assessment after his arrest. Public discussion increasingly shifted toward whether the aviation industry provided enough protection for pilots struggling silently with depression, stress, grief, or burnout. The conversation reached far beyond one courtroom. Pilots from around the world spoke publicly about fears tied to seeking mental health treatment. Many explained that admitting emotional distress can threaten medical certification and employment status. Critics argued this pressure may encourage struggling pilots to hide symptoms instead of seeking help early. Airline unions pushed for reforms. Mental health advocates called for more confidential support systems within aviation. Some experts compared the broader concerns to earlier aviation tragedies in which psychological instability played a role. Though investigators repeatedly stressed there was no evidence Emerson intended a planned mass casualty attack. Still, the legal consequences remain severe. In late 2024, Joseph Emerson entered guilty pleas to reduced federal charges connected to the incident. Prosecutors acknowledged the unusual psychological circumstances surrounding the case, while still emphasizing the enormous danger created aboard Flight 2059. The resolution avoided a lengthy public trial. Emerson also faced state-level charges connected to reckless endangerment and the threat posed to passengers and crew. Court proceedings reflected a difficult balance between accountability and recognition of mental collapse. For the passengers aboard the aircraft, however, legal arguments could not erase the memory of that flight. Some later described struggling with anxiety while traveling again. Others spoke about the emotional shock of realizing their survival depended largely on seconds of cockpit response. Crew members also carried the psychological impact long after headlines faded. The pilots who stopped Emerson received widespread praise throughout the aviation industry. Investigators credited their immediate action, communication, and adherence to emergency procedures with preventing potential catastrophe. Air traffic controllers involved in the diversion were also recognized for helping coordinate the emergency landing into Portland. Meanwhile, airlines quietly reviewed cockpit access procedures and pilot wellness policies. Though no major regulatory overhaul happened immediately, the incident intensified ongoing discussions inside aviation about mental health monitoring, fatigue management, and peer support systems for pilots under stress. The case also reignited debate around psychedelic substances. Authorities stated Emerson admitted using psilocybin mushrooms days before the flight. Experts later noted that psychedelic aftereffects can vary significantly depending on mental condition, dosage, sleep deprivation, and underlying psychological vulnerability. Investigators never claimed the mushrooms alone caused the incident, but they remained a major factor throughout the case. Public fascination with the story never fully disappeared. Television interviews, aviation breakdowns, courtroom sketches, and cockpit diagrams circulated online for months. The idea that a routine commercial flight nearly transformed into disaster because of a hidden psychological crisis unsettled millions of travelers. And beneath all the headlines sat a reality that made the story especially haunting. Nothing outwardly appeared wrong before takeoff. Passengers boarded normally. The crew followed standard procedures. The aircraft climbed smoothly into clear air over the Pacific Northwest. For most people aboard Flight 2059, it looked like another ordinary trip home. Then, at 31,000 feet, a single moment inside the cockpit changed everything. Because of two pilots reacting within seconds, 83 people walked away safely that day. But the incident exposed something aviation still struggles to confront openly. Even in professions built on discipline, precision, and control, the human mind can fracture quietly long before anyone notices. And somewhere over Oregon, behind the locked cockpit door of a passenger jet, that fracture nearly became a catastrophe remembered forever.